The NFL season has kicked off with a bang, so in today's video, I want to talk about 5 of the most surprising teams thus far through the first 2 weeks. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about the 5 most surprising NFL teams through 2 weeks of the season. Obviously, we're very early in the season, so these teams may just have a quick start and eventually will fizzle out. But as of right now, when I'm recording this video, these teams have been extremely surprising and much better than I think the most consensus was on these teams. However, before we get into the video, if you guys do go on to enjoy today's video, hit the like and subscribe button. We are on the road to 10,000 subscribers, so make sure you hit it if you haven't already. But let's get into the video. Coming in at number 5 is going to be the LA Chargers. Now, I think for most people's accounts, we all thought the Chargers were going to be a much better team in 2024 than they were in 2023. And given the fact they've had 2 relatively easy games against the Panthers and the Raiders, it wasn't very shocking when they've become 2-0. But I think what makes them a surprising team has been how dominant they've been on both sides of the football. In week 1 against the Raiders, the game was really not that competitive, and that was a matchup that in last year's game, the Raiders were able to dominate that same Chargers team. But now that you have a new head coach and everyone is fully healthy, you go in there and basically control that matchup from start to finish. And then of course in that Panthers game, you again did the exact same thing where you dominated a inferior team. And as we sit here today, you currently are on top of your division with the Kansas City Chiefs still right there in the mix of it for it as well. And by all accounts, I think this is clearly a big time season for the Chargers. They look much improved. Justin Herbert and Harbaugh look like they are a match made in heaven. The offensive line looks much better. Defensively, they have impressed me a ton. And given my expectations of this team, where I did not think they were going to be making the playoffs, if they do somehow keep up this level of pace and keep playing at this level, I think there is a definite chance that this LA Chargers team can potentially make the playoffs. Again, it's very early to even start making those predictions, but if you look all around the rest of the AFC, there have been certain teams that have definitely fallen down a tier, whereas the LA Chargers have potentially moved up a tier. As an example, you can look in their own division with the Raiders and Broncos. Yes, I know the Raiders beat the Ravens, but that was a bit of a fluky game, but you're clearly the second best team in the division. Then you look at like the AFC East, where the Dolphins have a ton of issues. Basically the entirety of the AFC South, which has been very disappointing outside of Houston. And when you look at the AFC North, there's definitely a couple teams that this Chargers team could, one, beat, but also potentially beat out for a playoff spot. So given my expectation for this team heading into the year and given where they're currently at, they're definitely sitting in a very good spot. And if they keep things up, they'll probably be making the playoffs. But let's go ahead and move on to number 4, which is going to be the Arizona Cardinals. Now, yes, they are not undefeated. They are 1-1, but they've had 2 very difficult matchups to start their season off, but they have performed very well. In week 1, you had a very close and tightly contested game against the Buffalo Bills, where you led for the majority of the first half until, of course, the wheels kind of started to fall off and Josh Allen started to play like an MVP. There's really nothing that can be said about that loss. You were going in a tough matchup against a good team at their stadium and you lost, so there's no real any flack for that one. The simple fact though that you were able to keep that game competitive and almost win that game was incredibly impressive. Then in your week 2 game, you completely disposed of what is a really good LA Rams team. Thus far this season, you've scored 69 total points and have only given up 44 points, which by the way, when you compare that to the rest of their division, they have 20 more points than the second closest team to them, which is both Seattle and San Francisco, who have put up 49 points. So through 2 games, you're averaging around 34.5 points per game, which is unbelievably impressive for an offense that hasn't been very good the past couple years. I would say some of the more surprising things about this offense is how good Kyler Murray has looked. Am I ready to put him in Pro Bowl or All-Pro or MVP conversations quite yet? Obviously not. We still have a full season left to go. But thus far through 2 weeks, you can make a case that he has been a top 5 quarterback through the first 2 weeks. And if Kyler Murray can continue to play like this, and if he can continue to build that chemistry with Marvin Harrison Jr., then we're talking about a team that definitely has the potential to be, relatively good this year. Unlike a team like the LA Chargers, I don't know if this Cardinals team has the talent to get to a playoff spot, but that's just because I look at the defensive side of the ball and just feel like there's a big lack of talent there. But given how they performed last year, where they were very impressive in certain spots, and how they've looked thus far this year, you can definitely make a case that they are a team that could be lobbying for a playoff spot come December. And if that's the case, that's an impressive season, and I would say thus far they've been very impressive given where our expectations were for that team. Coming in at number 3 is going to be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, I know this was a team that made it to the playoffs last year, so it shouldn't really feel like it's been all that impressive of a start for them. But given the fact that my personal expectations of them were a lot lower than what felt like the consensus of it, I would say thus far they've been really impressive and for the most part pretty surprising. They are 2-0. They have a victory over the Washington Commanders and most importantly and more impressively, the Detroit Lions. Coming into the season last year, the Buccaneers went 9-8, made a nice little playoff run, and I kind of felt like that was their ceiling, but thus far through 2 weeks, Baker Mayfield has looked like a top 5 quarterback, and the rest of the team has played very well as well. While they weren't really scoring a ton of points against that Lions team in week 2, they got enough points to win that game against a very good Lions team, which by the way was able to outgain them in passing yards and running yards. Yet despite that, this Buccaneers team was able to muster enough offense and play good enough defense to create some turnovers and ultimately win the game. And again, given the fact that I thought this was the Falcons division to win, I really felt like the Buccaneers weren't going to be all that good, and so far through the season, they've not only looked like a top 5 team, but they've also looked like the best team in that division, barring maybe a team we'll talk about here in a second. And in entirety, this entire division, I would say outside of obviously Carolina, has been very impressive thus far. Obviously, Atlanta's kind of been dealt a tough hand of cards here because they had a week 1 matchup against Pittsburgh and then a week 2 matchup against the Eagles. And for them to go 1-1, given the Achilles injury of Kirk Cousins and given how there's some chemistry issues there, I would say they've looked quite good. But on top of that division is the reigning champions of that said division, which is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and I would say thus far they look like potentially the team to beat. The defense has looked good, the offense has looked good as well, Baker Mayfield has looked great, and maybe an MVP candidate right now, so shout out to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Maybe I was wrong on you guys. Coming in at number 2 is going to be the Minnesota Vikings. Obviously, week 1 was a bit of an easy matchup for them going up against a bad New York Giants team, so I think we all felt like that was going to be a pretty easy victory for a team that is way more talented. But even despite the obvious talent gap between these two teams, they beat them up and spit in their face. I mean, they even said that they felt bad for Daniel Jones. That's how badly they were beating their ass. The final score of that game was 28-6, and it really wasn't that competitive throughout the game. But then in week 2, you have a really tough matchup against San Francisco where everyone's thinking that it's going to be really hard for you to beat a really good team, but you actually beat them and you make Brock Purdy look very human. In that game, they were able to force turnovers, make Brock Purdy uncomfortable, eliminate some of their major weapons like Debo and Ayuk, and offensively, they got the job done. Obviously, the highlight of that game was the big touchdown to Justin Jefferson, which is going to be remembered for a long time, but I would say the entire performance was very good and very clean. Now, I will say this, the rest of their schedule for the upcoming weeks is pretty damn brutal because you have the Texans, the Packers, the Jets, and the Lions in 4 straight weeks. But I'm looking at those games and I think that those are fairly winnable games, at least from what I've seen from this Vikings team so far. If you were to ask me what I thought their record would be maybe through the first 6 or 7 weeks of the season, I probably would have said maybe 1-5 or 2-4 at best. But now I look at the remainder of their games for the next couple weeks and I can see some victories here. Like, I think that Texans team will beat them, but it could be a close matchup. And now that the Packers are having injury issues with Jordan Love, who knows? So given my expectations of where they would be at heading into maybe week 7 or week 5, I think that they are looking really sharp and I think they have a good chance of winning some of these tough matchups. And I would say the biggest shocker and biggest surprise of them all has been Sam Darnold, who has looked completely revolutionized out there. We're talking about a guy who was a major bust for the New York Jets, went to Carolina, looked terrible there, and has sort of resurrected his career with San Francisco and now the Minnesota Vikings. Maybe you can make the case that the quarterback situation for Carolina and the New York Jets is just not good for young quarterbacks, and going to a team that's actually properly run like San Francisco and like Minnesota can maybe reestablish some of these quarterbacks to be good. So for Bryce Young, go to Minnesota. But of course, at number 1 is going to be the New Orleans Saints. This one really shouldn't come as a surprise at all. They have been unbelievably dominant through 2 weeks. Now, that week 1 victory against Carolina wasn't all that impressive because you beat up on what is the worst team in the NFL by a country mile. Yes, you beat them 47-10, but that was a total wipe out of that entire Panthers team, and honestly, it didn't really speak too much to me. But then you went into Dallas, into Jerry's world, going up against the Dallas Cowboys, and you did the exact same thing to a team that I still believe is a playoff team. And to me, that's what really makes this offense impressive. They were able to run the ball effectively, putting up 44 points against a Cowboys team that is likely going to be making the playoffs. And yes, Dallas does not have a good run defense, but they typically have good run defenses against average to bad teams. So heading into this game, I really thought the Dallas Cowboys were going to be able to do enough in that run defense to win that matchup until ultimately they couldn't. And Kubiak, their offensive coordinator, put together a game plan that was absolutely brilliant. And through 2 weeks, they've put up the most points by far in the NFL, putting up over 44 points in each game, while also holding it down defensively, creating some turnovers and just playing at a very high level. And I never thought I would say this, but they are in my top 10 and have a very good chance of moving into my top 5 after these next 3 weeks. Because next week you have Philadelphia, then you have Atlanta, and then you have the biggest test of them all against the Kansas City Chiefs. And something I didn't think I was going to be doing at the beginning of the season, I actually predicted the Saints to beat the Eagles in week 3, so we'll see if that ages well. Heading into the season, I had almost zero faith in the New Orleans Saints. In fact, if you go back to my channel and watch one of my videos I made on them, it was a very depressing and dark video on the Saints talking about how I felt like they had no future. But here we are 2 weeks into the season, and they're my most shocking team in the league, and they very well might be my playoff favorite for that division, which is something that I did not think was going to happen. And we're sitting here today and I'm completely shocked, but I'm also very happy for them. I feel like the NFL is better when you have a good New Orleans Saints team out there. Derek Carr is looking like the clear, maybe second best quarterback through the first 2 weeks, maybe even the best. Alvin Kamara looks rejuvenized. Tyrann Mathieu looks good. Everything is just really clicking right now, and that offense looks incredibly scary. So we will have to wait and see if they can hold this up against the Eagles and against the Chiefs and some of these really good matchups moving forward, but I think they have the schedule and the team to have a really awesome season in 2024, which makes them my #1 most shocking team in the NFL. But if you guys enjoyed the video and have any criticism about my list, let me know in the comment section below, and hit the like and subscribe button while you're there, and I love you guys. Peace.